intervention you want. Nazis are the definition of massive government control. And if you ever go on, and I encourage you to do so, go on one of these Nazi websites and you'll look at their priorities, and they despise the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. They despise free market capitalism. They despise the things that make up America. They are not right-wing, they're left-wing. Now, the second thing I despise about these programs, well, before I get to the second thing, but so even though these Nazis are really left-wing,
yep,
they are lumped together with conservative, right-of-center groups like the Heritage Foundation and Breitbart and Prager and Blue Lives Matter. But then the second thing that just chaps my hide, if I may say, is that all of this effort is being targeted toward domestic terrorism. I'll give you some examples of domestic terrorism. The riots that took place during Black Lives Matter.
Right.
And the federal buildings like courthouses and things that were burned, attempted to be destroyed, and cops who were murdered, and civilians who were murdered. Remember Chaz and Chop in San Francisco, or
yep,
not, in
Seattle
and Portland,
yep,
where people were murdered. Yet nary a comment can be found anywhere in any of these anti-violence programs about any of that kind of mayhem. And in fact, some of the materials we discovered said that if you believe that that the Black Lives Matter movement involved violence and terrible things, that's evidence that you're a terrorist.
We've seen this just this week when they've talked about, the third anniversary of the death of George Floyd, and the way it's described is a remarkable whitewash of what the history of the time was, because it was basically like Floyd died, and then there was a global revolution for change, and there's no mention of rioting and property destruction and police and citizens being killed,
assassinated
to a larger degree than January 6th.
Yeah.
This was one of the reasons the Republicans said, well, we would like to have a committee on riots and talk about the other riots too. And they were like, no, we're whitewashing those. We're going to call those a rebellion.
You're not allowed to use the word whitewash any longer. It's among the list that Stanford says is a triggering word.
Well, if we let Black Lives Matter get away with it, is it blackwashing? That sounds racist.
Yes. We'll have to consult with Stanford what the term we're supposed to use.
If we tried to create terminology based on what the left tells us what to say, I mean, they basically their whole plan would be to tie us in knots.
Yes.
They don't really believe in us having much freedom to speak.
Correct.
And that's sort of what this is. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that if we showed up somewhere to engage in free speech and somebody shows up with a Nazi flag, I'm turning around and walking the other way. I'm not going to be associated with that. I don't want that in somebody's cell phone picture, because I reject all of that. But yes, we've had that discussion here many times. It's the National Socialist Party. That's what the Nazis are. But I guess they play this whole game. This has been the problem with the left-right ideological spectrum, which was to say, well, conservatives, they're really into the military. They're really into machismo. And they tend to like the whites best. Therefore, they're Hitler. I mean, it is kind of a crazy pyramid that they make.
My wife often says, who's a liberal because they never have smiles on their faces and they have no fun. Whereas conservatives, we're happy people. We like America and we have fun.
And we're also used to this kind of abuse, and so this is like people saying, how can you sit there and watch television news all day? And it's like, no, you get used to it. Where on a day like today, like it's Friday, Memorial Day weekend, and people are coming in my office going, it's dull out there. Nobody's saying mean things about us. They're talking about airfares and picnics.
Well, you mean they're reporting on the events of the day?
Or what, they're trying to be in sync with where people are on a day like this. I mean, Fridays can be slow news days to begin with. But it does sound like the debt ceiling thing is coming to a close, perhaps. I don't know how, on some level, Kevin McCarthy will be tied in with some pyramid when this thing is all over. I mean, can you imagine? Let me ask you this. If under Trump, the liberals FOIA'd and found that the Department of Homeland Security had a pyramid, and at the bottom was MSNBC, and at the top was the Communist Party USA or Al-Qaeda, who knows? I mean, they would lose their ever-loving minds.
Well, and let me just remind you, it's not merely a pyramid. It is a pyramid that's used to activate people, to disrupt, to deploy, to silence these organizations. I know this sounds a little extreme, but let's look at what Nixon did at Watergate.
Mm-hmm.
He had his guys break in to find out what the Democrats were going to be saying.
Mm-hmm.
Today, the Democrats are breaking in to silence what we want to say. That's actually worse. It's worse than what Nixon did.
Well, usually when the liberals are saying something's worse than Watergate, it's they're trying to say George W. Bush was worse than Nixon. Donald Trump was worse than Nixon. But I think if we're going to have a moment of modern history, Watergate has always been over-characterized. And in sort of the same way that January 6th was over-characterized. And that is, have you ever read Victor Lasky?
No.
It didn't start with Watergate. This for the young people could go out and find Victor Lasky. But obviously, the FBI, for example, was surveilling Martin Luther King. There was a lot of dirty pool that was going on under Kennedy and Johnson. But what you had at that time, of course, was a press corps that loved JFK and was buddy-buddy with Lyndon. And so Nixon winning that election, they were all very upset. So, I mean, it was the beginning of scandal politics.
Yeah.
Scandals now are a major way that political parties fight with each other, and the media is obviously very crucial in all that. Let me ask you this, now that I've gone way off the point. So you say you've only released some. You've got more in reserve. What could you, I wouldn't want to say promise, but what could readers expect in the forthcoming weeks and months?
Oh, sadly, very sadly, we have lots to report because these programs are really so evil and so horrible. But yeah, on this first pyramid chart that we've described, Tim, I don't see your name on it.
We want an MRC logo. We need a bulldog on that pyramid.
So the next report we release, it's going to include NewsBusters.
Oh.
MRC's NewsBusters as part of the evil conspiracy that must be silenced.
The far right.
Yeah, this is actually a document that my team just uncovered 10 minutes before I walked into the studio to have this conversation with you. Keep in mind, Joe Biden stood on the steps of Independence Hall and essentially said that half of Americans are fascists or near fascists. So these documents that we are uncovering from DHS and the State Department simply are consistent with what their boss, the chief executive of the executive branch of government, is saying. President Biden has said half of America are fascists. All right, well, let's stop the fascists, like Heritage Foundation. That's what his administration is up to.
Or in other words, the conservative movement is the enemy of the people. I mean, again, when Donald Trump suggested that fake news is the enemy of the people, they said democracy is dying in darkness.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think this is kind of what this suggests, is that we want, the government is investigating the dangers of conservative speech.
Tim, I know this is not entirely responsive to you, but a personal story. A number of times when I've confronted liberals, both face-to-face and through Twitter, when they're calling me a fascist or something, I've challenged them. Define fascism without making reference to a person. I have yet to find a single person on the left who's able to do so, because all they ever do is say, you're a fascist. Trump's a fascist. Bush is a fascist. Okay, define they can't do it. You just get these blank looks if you're looking them in the face. On Twitter, they just go silent. They don't know what fascism is. It's just a slur they throw around.
I'll match you with the story. Now in the 80s, I was an intern briefly for Robert Novak, who a lot of our younger listeners may not recall. Evans and Novak, who in the 80s had a show on weekends on CNN. They were prominent columnists in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I was at a dinner party, and the rule of the dinner party was we're not going to discuss politics because it was a diverse grouping. And then somebody walked in and started saying that Robert Novak's a fascist. And I was like, excuse me, I don't mean to disturb the rules, but I did exactly that. How is Robert Novak a fascist? For which they did not have an answer. Now, I wasn't going to drag it out for 10 minutes because we were supposed to be in polite company. But in my experience, in my personal experience, the conservatives always seem to be politer company.
We're happier people.
If you have a rule that says let's not discuss politics, I will try to observe that. Mrs. Graham will kick me in the shin if I break the rule. She likes a nice civil dinner party.
Does she prefer kicking you in the shin as to your butt, or?
Yeah, well, you can do it under the table. I think it'd be harder to kick the butt under the table.
Okay.
And then she also will do that at church if I sing too loud.
Really?
You're getting carried away there, mister.
Your sonorous voice, I assume.
Well, this is part of the problem, yes. I can get too enthusiastic in a hymn. So, which is apparently, yes. We also have this. Catholics who go to Latin masses. That's not really my thing, but I get a kick out of that. Latin mass Catholics are a threat. The FBI is putting out memos saying we better go to these traditional Latin masses because that's where the terrorists gather.
And so, like many of the people listening to this, I very much like the Godfather series. So when I've heard
Brent Bozell too.
When I've heard that the FBI is going into church parking lots, to spy on Catholics, I'm remembering that scene. I think it's the first Godfather movie, when the FBI is going and writing down the license plate numbers of all the vehicles, in front of the Corleone complex.
There's all these dangerous anti-abortion stickers. What are we going to do with these people? They're clearly a domestic violence threat. And of course, I would say abortion is a violent threat. They never seem to acknowledge abortion is violence. All right. Well, I think we've run through what you've done, what you're doing, what you expect to do. We're very excited about this at Newsbusters. We are doing original reporting, digging into the government. I'm very excited to see the next round. And so should you be. Keep turning to Newsbusters. We'll let you know when there's more. Have a good Memorial Day weekend, and maybe in between the hot dogs, you can squeeze in a little Newsbusters once, twice, 24 times a day. Thanks for listening.